The rain had come down all morning, not in sheets, but in an unrelenting mist that soaked into the very bones of the city. Gray clouds sat low and heavy over the skyline, blurring edges and softening corners. In the heart of that misty chill, Dr. Elijah Ward stepped out of St. Jude Memorial Hospital, a paper cup of coffee cupped between his hands and a stethoscope still hanging around his neck. He was young, 30 at most, but something in his eyes carried years that hadn't passed yet. He wore tiredness like a second skin, not from physical exhaustion alone but from what the long days took out of him. Night shifts blurred into day shifts. People left in ambulances and didn't always come back. He hadn't gotten used to it. He wasn't sure he ever would. He stood just under the edge of the awning, letting the mist cling to his face, sipping the coffee more for the warmth than the taste. Across the street on the edge of the park that bordered the hospital, a man sat on a bench hunched beneath a patchwork coat. The kind of coat stitched together by necessity, not fashion. His beard was thick, wild, with streaks of gray, his hair tangled at the nape. A weather-beaten backpack sat beside him, plastic bags cinched around his feet to keep out the wet. The man had been there all week. Elijah had seen him once or twice nodding off on the bench, occasionally speaking to a small flock of pigeons as if they were old friends. Most people passed him without a glance, some with averted eyes, others with looks of disdain. Elijah had dropped a granola bar in his lap once on the way out. He hadn't even looked up. That morning something changed. The man didn't move at all. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He stepped off the curb, coffee forgotten, instincts sharper than the rain that clung to him. By the time he crossed the street, he could see the man's face more clearly. Pale, slack-jawed, his chest didn't rise. "Sir," Elijah said softly. He reached out, touched the man's shoulder. It was icy beneath the coat. No response. He dropped to one knee, checking for a pulse at the neck, the wrist. Nothing. "Hey," he called out to the security guard at the entrance. "Call the ER, get a gurney, now." The guard blinked, startled, then ran inside. Elijah started chest compressions, his hands steady, precise. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The rain pelted his back, water creeping down the collar of his scrubs. He didn't stop. The paramedics arrived moments later, but Elijah stayed beside the man all the way into the trauma bay, barking vitals, refusing to let go of the patient's wrist. In the sterile chaos of the ER, surrounded by bright lights and monitors, the man finally gasped. It was wet, ragged, but real. His eyes fluttered open just enough for Elijah to see them, pale blue, almost silver in the overhead light. "He's back," Elijah said, breath catching. "He's back." The nurses started stabilizing him. IVs were placed, warm fluids, oxygen, heated blankets. "Dr. Ward," someone said behind him, "you okay?" He nodded slowly. His hands were shaking now that it was over. But the man, this stranger who had nearly died in the cold, who had been all but invisible to everyone else, was alive. Hours later, the man lay in a private observation room, hooked to monitors, sleeping under layers of warmth. His name was still unknown. No ID, no known allergies, no emergency contact, just a man who had been dying alone until someone cared enough to stop. Elijah stood at the foot of the bed, chart in hand. The initial tests showed hypothermia, moderate dehydration, early signs of pneumonia, but nothing that couldn't be treated. The man stirred. "You're safe," Elijah said gently. "You're in the hospital. I'm Dr. Ward. You collapsed outside." The man blinked slowly, confusion flickering behind tired eyes. Then he nodded once. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a rasp. "You didn't have to." Elijah smiled softly. "I'm a doctor, of course I did." The man's eyes drifted closed again, but not before Elijah saw something flicker through them. Not just gratitude, but something deeper, something like sorrow. For the next week, the man remained in the hospital. Slowly, he grew stronger, still no name. He refused to give one. The nurses started calling him Ben. It stuck. Ben spoke little, ate quietly, and spent hours looking out the window at the trees just starting to bud. There was a softness in the way he watched the world, as if it was something distant and beautiful he couldn't quite touch anymore. Elijah found himself sitting with him between rounds, bringing coffee, listening to the silence. It was comfortable, honest. Sometimes Ben would say a sentence or two. Other times they didn't need to speak at all. One afternoon, Ben looked at him and asked, "Why are you really here, Dr. Ward?" Elijah hesitated. "Because you matter." Ben tilted his head slightly. "Even if I'm no one." "You're not no ones." Ben didn't reply, but his eyes stayed on Elijah for a long time after that. Outside of the quiet room, life moved on. There were gunshot wounds, cardiac arrests, broken bones, screaming families, and long, sleepless nights. Elijah moved through it all with practiced grace, but his mind always circled back to the man in room 218. There was something about him, something unplaceable, the way he watched people, the way he sometimes asked questions that dug deeper than small talk. What makes someone worth saving? He had asked one day, and Elia hadn't known how to answer. But the question stayed with him. A week later, Ben was medically cleared for discharge, but there was nowhere to send him. Elias stared at the discharge summary for a long time, then he did something reckless. Something his attending would have warned him against. He walked into the room and said, "I have a spare room." Ben looked up surprised. "You're offering me your home." Elias shrugged, playing it off, "Just until we figure something else out." Ben watched him carefully, then nodded once. "All right." That night, Elia cleared off the futon in his spare room, made up the bed with clean sheets, left a towel folded on the end. Ben stepped in, quiet as ever, carrying the same worn backpack. "I don't need much," he said. "I know," Elia replied. They stood in the small apartment kitchen a few minutes later, each with a mug of tea. The light was warm. The rain had started again outside. Ben looked at the bookshelf, the photos, Elia as a boy, Elia in med school, Elia with his mother. "You're a good man," Ben said. Elia shook his head, smiling faintly. "I just didn't want to watch you die." "That's exactly what makes you good." Ben sipped his tea. In that moment he looked more at peace than Elia had ever seen him. And still, he didn't give his real name. Elia didn't push, not yet. What he didn't know was that Ben wasn't just a homeless man who had nearly died on a park bench. He was someone much more powerful, much more hidden, a man who had walked away from an empire to find something real. And now, quietly, he was beginning to believe he just had. Ben settled into Elia's spare room with the quietness of someone who had learned how to take up as little space as possible. He folded his clothes, few as they were, with careful hands, unpacking his meager belongings with reverence. A paperback novel missing its cover, a photograph so creased it barely held together, a pocket knife dulled by time. He asked for nothing and offered little, but he listened. Elia found himself talking more than he had in years. It wasn't anything intentional. There was just something about Ben's presence, an openness not loud or probing but still there, as if his silence created space for other people's truths to slip out unbidden. Some evenings after long shifts at the hospital, Elia would come home, kick off his shoes, and find Ben already in the kitchen, warming up soup or frying eggs like he belonged there. They shared meals in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the occasional thoughtful question. "How do you keep your heart open when it breaks every day?" Elia had been chopping carrots that night. He paused, knife halfway through the orange flesh. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Some days I don't think I do, I just keep showing up." Ben nodded slowly, as if that answer meant more than Elia realized. Days turned into weeks. Ben remained. Elia never asked for rent, never questioned how long he'd stay. It didn't feel like charity, it felt like something else, something harder to name. One night, Elia came home with blood on his sleeve, his shoulders heavy with grief. A young boy had died, the kind with bright eyes and a laugh that stuck in your mind, a seizure out of nowhere, a heart that stopped and wouldn't start again. Elia had done everything right, it hadn't mattered. Ben didn't speak, he just placed a hand on Elia's shoulder and gently guided him to the couch. They sat there in the dim light of the apartment, the sounds of the city soft through the window. Elia didn't cry, he rarely did, but his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I should have saved him." "You tried," Ben said quietly. "Trying doesn't bring him back." "No," Ben agreed, "but it still matters. He didn't die alone. That matters more than you think." Elia looked at him then, really looked. There was sorrow in Ben's face, yes, but not just sympathy, recognition, a knowing that came from lived experience. "Who did you lose?" Elia asked, the question out before he could stop it. Ben's eyes flicked away, he didn't answer. But the next morning, there was an extra mug of coffee waiting when Elia came into the kitchen, and Ben looked up with a ghost of a smile. "Go easy on yourself," he said. Around the same time, Elia started noticing something strange. A man in a sleek black car parked across the street there almost every morning when he left for work. A woman in tailored clothes lingering a little too long by the cafe near the hospital entrance. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence, but the repetition was too precise, the glances too sharp. One night, he came home late to find Ben sitting on the fire escape, watching the stars through the haze of city light. Elia climbed out beside him, joining him on the narrow metal ledge. "You ever feel like someone watching you?" Elia asked casually. Ben didn't look away from the sky all the time. Elia turned to him. You know something, don't you? Ben was quiet for a long moment, the sounds of the street far below rising and falling like the tide. There are people who wish I stayed gone, Ben said at last, and others who are waiting for me to come back. Back where? Ben met his gaze finally, and for the first time there was no evasiveness in his expression, just a weary honesty. Home, he said, if you can still call it that. He didn't elaborate and Elia didn't press him, but he didn't sleep much that night. It was a week later when the first real crack appeared in the illusion. Elia was at work when a man in a suit showed up at the hospital, asking for him by name. Tall, polished, the kind of person who didn't belong anywhere near the ER's worn linoleum floors. I'm looking for someone, the man said, handing Elia a photograph. We believe he may be under your care. Elia looked down at the picture. The face was younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakable. Ben. Who is he? Elia asked. The man's smile was tight. A missing person. We've been looking for him for over a year. Why? He has responsibilities, business interests. He's needed. Elia didn't reply. Please, the man said, if you see him, tell him it's time to come home. He left without further explanation, but the weight of his presence lingered. That night, Elia returned home and found Ben seated at the kitchen table, thumbing through the worn paperback novel like always. Elia set the keys down, leaned against the counter and said, Someone came looking for you today. Ben didn't flinch, I know. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to see me differently. Elia crossed his arms. What are you running from? Ben looked up at him, not running, searching. For what? Ben exhaled, eyes dark and tired. For someone who sees me without the name, without the money, just me. And suddenly it made sense. The observation, the restraint, the way he watched the world like a man tasting life for the first time in years. You're not homeless, Elia said quietly. Not really. No, Ben admitted, I chose this. The silence between them thickened. You let me believe you were just, Elia started but stopped himself. You were testing me. No, Ben said, not testing, hoping. He stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. You saved me, not because of who I was or what I had, just because you could. Elia stared at him, his pulse was loud in his ears. Are you leaving? He asked. I don't want to, Ben said, but I think my time hiding is running out. Then don't go yet. Ben's eyes softened. You'd still let me stay, he asked. You're not who I thought you were, but you are who I've come to know. Ben didn't answer, but something in his face broke open at those words. Relief, gratitude, a fragile kind of hope. That night they sat together in the living room, neither pretending anymore. And somewhere deep within Elia's chest, something shifted. He didn't know what it meant yet. But he knew that what was between them wasn't an accident. It was the start of something. The city was beginning to thaw, trees softened at the edges with hints of green, and the morning air smelled faintly of damp soil and something tender pushing its way through. Elia walked to work with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his breath still clouding in the air, but there was warmth beneath the chill now. The kind of warmth that made you believe something was about to change. Ben stayed. After their conversation, the silence between them grew even more comfortable. It was no longer the quiet of two strangers coexisting. It was the quiet of two men who had crossed a fragile line and decided not to retreat from it. Ben never spoke much about what he had walked away from, but Elia noticed subtle changes. A calloused habit of checking the locks at night, even when Elia already had. A slight tension when certain names came up on the news. And once when Elia came home early, he caught Ben reading the Wall Street Journal, eyes sharp and thoughtful, before sliding the paper beneath a pile of junk mail as if it didn't matter. It did. But Elia didn't press. He had learned that Ben revealed himself like winter melting into spring, slow, cautious, and in small, beautiful bursts. One morning, Elia overslept. He jolted awake to find the kitchen already full of sunlight and the smell of eggs and toast drifting down the hall. Ben stood at the stove, humming under his breath, a second plate already warming on the counter. I thought doctors were supposed to be early risers, he said, not looking up. Elia rubbed the back of his neck, smiling sheepishly. Rough shift. Ben slid a plate across the counter. Eat, unite it. Elia sat. They ate side by side in the kind of silence people pay money to find in therapy. When the last bite was gone, Elia leaned back in his chair and looked at Ben. You ever miss it, he asked, the life you had before? Ben thought for a long time, sometimes, but not the way you'd expect. What do you miss then? Ben's voice was quiet, the people I could have helped if I'd stayed the man I was pretending to be. That stayed with Elia the rest of the day. Meanwhile, whispers moved through the corridors of wealth and power. Boardrooms, law firms, private planes, all wondering where Benjamin Grayson had gone. No one said his name in the open, not yet, but they were looking. Grayson Holdings, the company he had built, the name he had buried, was in flux. His disappearance had sparked uncertainty. His silence had created questions. The public didn't know, but the inner circle did. His legal team, his CFO, the man who had come to the hospital, they knew, and they were losing patience. They hadn't just lost a CEO, they had lost a symbol, a machine. And now they wanted him back. But Ben had not walked away from money. He had walked away from the cost of it. From the way people looked at him with calculation instead of kindness. From boardroom dinners where no one asked about his heart, only his forecasts. From funeral flowers delivered by assistants and tears scheduled between meetings. He had walked away after the last thread of his life unraveled. After the person who'd known him before the empire died in a sterile room while he sat in a meeting about quarterly returns. And no one had said, go. No one had said, leave, we'll understand. So he had vanished. He had walked until the world forgot his name. And then he had collapsed in the cold. Elia didn't know the full story, not yet, but the pieces were beginning to show themselves. It started with a moment in the grocery store. They were standing in line when the man behind the register glanced up, did a double take, and narrowed his eyes at Ben. You look familiar, the cashier said. Ben offered a polite smile, people say that. But Elia caught the way his hand tensed around the shopping basket, the way he studied the gum rack like it held answers. Later in the car, Elia asked, do you ever think about going back? Ben didn't answer right away. He watched the traffic light turn from red to green before speaking. Sometimes I think it would be easier, he said, but then I remember that I finally sleep through the night. Elia nodded, understanding in the silence that followed. They were in the in-between now, not just roommates, not quite lovers, something warmer than friendship, gentler than romance, but not lacking in depth. The kind of bond that grew in the quiet moments people often overlooked. And then one morning, it all changed. Elia opened the door to find a man in a suit standing in the hallway, flanked by two others. Their expressions were practiced, pleasant in a way that felt off. Dr. Ward, the first man said, we need to speak with Mr. Grayson. Elia didn't move. Who? The man smiled, the one you've been harboring for the last 2 months. Ben stepped into the hallway behind Elia, his voice calm. It's all right. The suited man turned. Mr. Grayson, we've come to take you home. Ben studied him for a long moment. It's not my home anymore. Then consider it a responsibility. There are contracts, expectations. Ben's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders stiffened. I'm not a product, he said. I don't belong to a board. The man's tone sharpened. This isn't about what you want, it's about what's owed. That was when Elia stepped between them. He's not going anywhere, he said. Ben touched his arm gently. Elia. No, Elia said, facing the man squarely. If you want him to come back, maybe ask instead of cornering him like he's a runaway asset. The man didn't reply, but Elia saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes before they turned and walked away. Ben watched them go with a strange mixture of regret and resolve. I should have told you everything, he said later that night. Elia sat beside him on the couch. I didn't need everything, I just needed the truth you were ready to share. Ben looked down at his hands. They'll keep coming. I know, and it might get messy. I can handle messy. Ben turned toward him, something raw behind his eyes. Why are you still here? Elia didn't flinch. Because when I found you, you were half frozen on a bench and I didn't see a stranger. I saw a man worth saving. That hasn't changed. Ben stared at him like no one had ever said that before. And maybe no one had. The silence between them then wasn't hollow. It was sacred. In the weeks that followed, the quiet intimacy of their lives began to unravel, not from within, but from the pressure pressing in around them. First, it was the media. A grainy photo appeared online. Ben, exiting a corner store in a hoodie, walking beside Elia. A tabloid headline followed, full of speculation and lazy insinuations. Reclusive billionaire spotted in disguise, mystery companion identified as local doctor. Elia found out at the hospital when a nurse handed him her phone with wide eyes. "You didn't tell us you were dating a ghost," she said, half joking. His stomach dropped. He didn't answer her. He just turned and walked into the break room, phone already ringing in his pocket. Ben's voice was calm on the other end. "I saw it." "I'm so sorry," Elia said quietly. Ben was silent for a moment, then, "Don't be." But Elia could hear the weariness underneath. By the time he got home that night, two men in dark jackets were parked across the street again. Not agents or security, reporters this time. One had a long-lens camera. The other pretended to be on the phone but kept glancing toward the building. Ben met him at the door with 2 mugs of tea and that same stillness in his eyes. Like a man watching the tide come in, already knowing what it would take. "We can't stay here," he said. Elia nodded. "I figured." They packed in silence, just enough to leave for a few days: clothes, a shaving kit, Elia's work laptop, the photo Ben kept hidden in the back of his drawer. They slipped out the back entrance under the cover of dusk, not running but not quite walking either. They drove for hours, the city shrinking behind them. No destination at first, just distance. Eventually, they found a rental cabin in the woods north of the river, tucked beside a lake that reflected the gray sky like a secret. It had creaky floorboards and mismatched furniture and the smell of pine that filled every room. No cell service, no Wi-Fi. Ben stood on the dock for a long time after they arrived, watching the water move in quiet ripples, hands in his coat pockets. Elia watched him from the porch, the wind biting his skin and pulling at the edges of his sleeves, but he didn't go inside. He stayed. When Ben finally spoke, his voice carried across the water like something fragile. "Her name was Maggie." Elia didn't ask who she had been, he just waited. "She was the only person who ever called me out for disappearing behind money, told me once that being kind wasn't a charity, that it was a choice you make every day, especially when no one's looking." Elia took a step closer. "She died 3 years ago," Ben said. "Cancer, and I missed the last week because I was negotiating a merger in Zurich." His voice cracked. "She called me and said she understood, that she didn't blame me, but I never forgave myself." Elia didn't say anything, just stood beside him on the dock, shoulder to shoulder, letting the grief rise and fall like the wind on the lake. "She used to call me Benny when I was being difficult," Ben said, a faint smile touching his lips. "No one else ever dared." They stood there until the light faded from the sky. Later, inside the warmth of the cabin, Elia made soup while Ben built a fire. The heat slowly filled the space, and with it something softer settled between them, the weight of honesty, the quiet gift of having nothing left to hide. After dinner, Elia sat cross-legged on the rug while Ben read in the armchair, the fire casting flickers of light across his face. There was a piece there Elia hadn't seen before, or maybe it had always been there, waiting to be named. "Do you miss it?" Elia asked, "that world?" Ben closed the book. "I miss the version of it I thought I could change." "And now?" Ben looked at him, something unguarded in his gaze. "Now I think the real change starts here." The next morning, Ben woke early. Elia was still asleep, curled on the couch beneath a blanket, his breath soft and steady. Ben stood at the window, watching the first light touch the treetops, and he felt something he hadn't in years. Readiness. He stepped outside and pulled his phone from his jacket. The signal was weak, but enough. He made the call. The man who answered sounded surprised. "Mr. Grayson." "I'm ready to talk," Ben said, "but on my terms." There was a pause. Understood. When he stepped back inside, Elia was sitting up, eyes still heavy with sleep. Ben crossed to him and knelt beside the couch. "I need to face this," he said. Elia nodded. "I know. But I want you there. You have me." Ben exhaled slowly, like a weight had lifted from somewhere deeper than lungs or spine. He leaned in, just enough for his forehead to rest against Elia. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For saying me." The meeting happened 3 days later in a quiet office outside the city, away from cameras, away from suits in towers. Ben wore jeans and a gray sweater, not a trace of silk or branding. Elia sat beside him, his hand resting loosely on his thigh beneath the table. Across from them sat 3 board members, a lawyer, and the man who had come to the hospital. The air was stiff with control, but Ben didn't shrink from it. I walked away because I was drowning, he said, because I was surrounded by people who used my name more than they used my humanity. The lawyer cleared his throat. You were the company. No, Ben said quietly. I was a man who created something and forgot to care for himself in the process. They talked for hours. When they left, nothing was signed, but something had shifted. Ben didn't reclaim the title. He didn't take the CEO seat again. Instead, he proposed something different, a foundation. Quiet work, grants for hospitals, shelters, community clinics, no press releases, no red carpet. He called it the Maggie Initiative. Elia didn't ask to be part of it, but he found himself drawn into the work anyway. Because something about it felt real. Because Ben had been right. The change did start here. Spring turned fully into summer, soft and steady, as if the world was remembering how to breathe again. Back at St. Jude Memorial, Elia returned to his usual rotation. The rhythms were the same: night shifts, rounds, the perpetual shuffle of humanity through pain and hope, but something inside him had changed, not hardened, if anything, the opposite. He moved through the hospital with a kind of stillness now, like a man who had learned how to hold space, not just fill it. And people noticed. Nurses lingered a little longer at the end of his shift. Patients smiled when he entered the room, even when the news wasn't good. He wasn't more skilled than before, but he was more there. Each conversation carried more weight, each gesture more intention. Because Elia had learned what it meant to see someone completely. And to be seen in return. Ben had returned to the city too, though not to the skyscrapers or limousines. He didn't move back into his penthouse. He left it untouched. Instead, he found a quiet loft above a bookstore in a neighborhood where no one recognized him, and if they did, they didn't care. The air smelled like old paper and brewed coffee. He walked to the park in the mornings, wrote letters by hand, and answered emails with purpose instead of urgency. He began to build the Maggie Initiative from the ground up. No headlines, no press conferences, just quiet grants and meaningful partnerships. One of the first recipients was a downtown clinic that had nearly closed its doors the year before. Another was a shelter near the hospital where he had first collapsed. Elia had helped him choose them, offering insight, connecting him with people who did good without asking for anything in return. At night, they often found themselves together, on Elia's porch, on Ben's rooftop, or tucked into the back corner of a quiet bar where the music hummed low and slow. There were no declarations, no big moments. Just the kind of love that grows quietly like ivy. One evening in late July, they sat by the lake again, having returned to the cabin for a weekend away. Fireflies blinked around them, and the moon made a silver path on the water. Elia lay stretched out on the dock, arms behind his head. Ben sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. I used to think healing came from fixing things, Elia said. Solving the problem, closing the wound, but now I think maybe it's more about staying close to the ache, not trying to erase it. Ben looked down at him, one hand resting lightly against Elia's chest, feeling the quiet drum of his heart. That's what you did for me, he said. They didn't kiss, not then, they didn't need to. The night held them gently, and the silence between them was enough. 3 months later, Elia received a call from the director of a small rural hospital 2 hours north. We're running on fumes, she said. Staff shortages, broken equipment, we're barely holding on. He listened, took notes, asked questions. That weekend, the Maggie Initiative launched a partnership. Funds came quietly, supplies followed, staff were supported. And Ben, once a ghost in boardrooms, stood beside Elia in the dusty ER that smelled of bleach and old linoleum, shaking hands with people who looked him in the eye, not for what he was worth, but for what he gave. One of the nurses approached him afterward, an older woman with laugh lines and ink smudges on her scrubs. You look familiar, she said, eyes narrowing. Ben smiled, maybe we've met before. She studied him a moment longer, then she nodded. Well, thank you, we needed this. He turned to Elia when she left. That's the first time in years someone thanked me and I believed it. Life didn't become perfect. Ben still had to navigate old ties, legal formalities, the occasional email from someone who wanted him to return to the man he used to be. Elia still worked long nights and came home exhausted, still lost patients he couldn't save. But they came home to each other now. They learned the shape of each other's silences, the weight of certain glances, the way to soothe without speaking. They made pancakes on Sundays, argued softly about which books to keep and which to donate. Ben learned to fold hospital corners on beds, Elia learned to let someone else care for him without apologizing. One morning, Elia found Ben on the porch, fingers ink-stained from writing. He held up the page when Elia sat beside him. It was a letter addressed to no one in particular. To the man who saved me without knowing who I was. To the man who looked past what I'd lost and offered me a way back into the world. You reminded me I was still human, still worthy. You showed me that being seen isn't always about being known. Sometimes it's about being understood. And in the quiet that you live in so well, I found the parts of myself I thought were gone. I'm not who I was and I'll never go back. But because of you, I know who I want to be. Thank you. Elia read it slowly. When he looked up, Ben's eyes were already on him. I didn't write it to mail, Ben said softly. I wrote it because I needed you to know. Elia reached for his hand, curling their fingers together. I've known, he said, from the moment you woke up in that hospital bed. They sat there, sun warming their backs, birds calling faintly through the trees, and in that stillness something settled, not just between them but inside them. A story that had begun on a cold bench, with a stranger nearly lost to the world, had become something else entirely. Not a rescue, not a test, but a return. And this time, neither of them would walk away.